Robert Cecil was one of England's most feared spy chiefs. He was also a man of contradictions. On one hand, he was a passionate Protestant who brutally opposed and stamped down on the Catholic faith in England. On the other, he conspired to put the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. But perhaps his greatest achievement was foiling the largest terrorist plot ever conceived, the infamous gunpowder plot. The plan was devilishly simple: blow up the Houses of Parliament and kill King James I and all his government.
Cecil was a passionate Protestant, and his belief in the new faith and his hatred of Catholics fashioned the whole of his career.
Basically what they did was push the Catholics into a corner, push them further and further into the corner, and they were going to come out fighting even if they had to die in the attempt.
The Catholics were not going to take it from James, so just 2 years into his reign, they plotted something so devastating, so audacious, that it really does draw parallels with the major terrorist threats of today. They wanted nothing less than the destruction of the entire regime. They were going to achieve it by blowing up the king and Parliament.
Had the gunpowder plot have succeeded, it would have not only changed the course of British history, but world history. And to be quite honest, it would have been the most audacious terror attack in the history of the world.
Robert Cecil was born in 1563 in London, the son of Lord Burleigh, one of Queen Elizabeth's closest advisors. And from an early age, he was groomed to be a great statesman like his father. A physically awkward man who was born with a hunchback, he nevertheless had a great intellect and first-class contacts. After entering the Houses of Parliament in 1584, he was soon knighted by the Queen and sworn into her Privy Council at the age of just 28, its youngest ever member.
Robert Cecil owed his career to his father, William, Lord Burleigh, who had been the longest-serving and arguably the most faithful of all Elizabeth I's courtiers. She adored Lord Burleigh. He was the one man above all others whose advice she would listen to. So that served his son Robert in two ways. Not only did it give him a very good introduction to the Queen, she was predisposed to like him, but also he had been trained up very well indeed by his father. He could not have chosen any other career even if he'd wished to. The natural path to follow was service to the Queen.
During the 1590s, Robert Cecil was acting in all but name as principal secretary, and then in 1596 he was made secretary. In those positions, he had a close relationship with the Queen. He was dealing with intelligence work, and he was dealing with a wide range of administrative and political issues. He was a very important figure.
Robert Cecil's born with a silver spoon in his mouth. The trouble is, it's a rather small spoon because he's a second son. He's also physically unimpressive, small and stunted, so he's actually got quite a lot against him. What he has in favour is a clever father and a brilliant mind of his own.
After 44 mostly glorious years on the throne of England, Queen Elizabeth, the last of the Tudor monarchs, had not produced an heir. So one of Cecil's first tasks was to sort out the tricky subject of succession.
Cecil experienced something of a baptism of fire over the succession crisis because a lot of Elizabeth's greatness derived from the fact that she was the Virgin Queen, but of course that had a very inherent problem. It left her with no direct heirs. She hadn't married, she hadn't had children. And even while she was still alive, there was a sense of impending crisis around who would succeed her. Robert Cecil, along with many other courtiers, had no doubt that it would be James VI of Scotland, ironically the son of Elizabeth's deadliest enemy, Mary, Queen of Scots, and he was sending contacts up there, agents up there. He was going and writing to James on a regular basis to try and court favour with the man that he was confident would be king. But everybody predicted there would be riots, there would be rebellions. We don't want a Stuart king, we don't want a foreigner, as he was seen. And Cecil had to deal with all of this.
Even before Elizabeth's death, arrangements were made so that there would not be a political vacuum when she passed away. The proclamation for James's succession was drafted. Arrangements were made for surveying the scene so that any pretenders to the throne would not be able to present themselves. And when Elizabeth died, everything was quickly put into action.
Robert Cecil used secrecy as his weapon, so news of the Queen's death was not immediately announced until a rider had been dispatched up to Scotland to tell James that he was now king, and it was almost then presented as a fait accompli. There was very little that could be done, and indeed, it was remarkably peaceful. After all the fears of rebellion and everything else, James came to the throne like an apple falling from a tree, it was said. It just went smoothly from one succession to the next.
Like his father before him, the Protestant Robert Cecil had a deep mistrust of Catholics and saw them as real troublemakers and a credible threat to his newly installed monarch. As a result, he came down hard on the powers of the Catholic Church in England and expelled a large number of priests and bishops.
Instead of trying to appease the Catholic threat or understand it even, Robert Cecil just went hell for leather to try and eradicate it. This, of course, was not going to go down too well with the threat itself. And basically what they did was push the Catholics into a corner, push them further and further into the corner, and they were going to come out fighting even if they had to die in the attempt.
Catholics had suffered decades of really quite severe persecution. Almost 200 of them had been put to death in the reign of Elizabeth, and most of them in the last 20 years of the reign. So when they find that nothing very much seems to be changing under James, there is immense disappointment among them.
For the best part of 100 years, Roman Catholics were second-class citizens. They had to practice their faith in secret. They were arrested, they were tortured, they were tried, they were hanged, drawn and quartered. They were fed up, and they wanted revenge.
The word Catholic was synonymous with terrorist, as we would understand it in modern parlance. They were the equivalent of the IRA or other terror threats to the country, and certainly they were seen as deadly. And there was that same sense of widespread panic and paranoia every time a fresh terrorist plot came to light.
Needless to say, this purge of Catholics in England produced a huge backlash of resentment and anger against the king and his government. Cecil had to work hard to track down and try and keep a lid on all the plots and intrigues swirling around the country. He had to employ all the tools of spycraft at his disposal, from intercepting and deciphering coded documents to paying informants, and above all, using double agents.
Cecil, the spy master, had inherited an impressive network, an impressive history of espionage in England. begun really by Thomas Cromwell, but then greatly enhanced by Walsingham. So by the time Cecil took over it, it was incredibly sophisticated. He added to it, though, because he had more to deal with, in a sense. There had been plots, of course, against Elizabeth I, but the change of regime always created instability. It always gave force to the enemies of the new regime. And the Stuarts weren't as popular as the Tudors had been, so it was an altogether more vulnerable position that Robert Cecil found himself having to deal with.
Cecil is a perfect spy master because he's addicted to paperwork and to news, and he's addicted to royal service. He just loves nothing better than working round the clock. And he's also creative. He loves manipulation. He's got a theatrical side to his character. He's relentlessly ambitious. He's the perfect person for the post.
What Robert Cecil is doing in his intelligence work is concentrating less on the enemy within and more on the enemy from outside. So he puts a new amount of energy into finding out what's happening on the continent, and he's putting resources into it. He doesn't have new technologies. He doesn't have new ways of dealing with it. He is using the same old methods of deciphering, searching, suborning agents. But what he tries to do is have a broader base of men on the continent who are telling him what the King of Spain is doing, where the naval resources are building up.
You could push the imagination a long way to say that Cecil is an Ian Fleming villain recast as a loyal royal servant. He is physically stunted, he is ambitious, he has a cold, hard, calculating, utterly unscrupulous mind. He probably would have stroked a white Persian cat had they been around to stroke, but he's on the government side.
Perhaps the most infamous of all the assassination attempts on the king was the so-called gunpowder plot. The plan was simple. Plant dozens of large barrels of gunpowder under the Palace of Westminster, and then blow it up while King James was sitting in the main chamber above during the opening of Parliament, killing him and most of the government instantly.
Probably the most crucial threat or plot that Robert Cecil had to deal with was the gunpowder plot. We've got approximately a dozen disaffected Roman Catholic aristocrats that wanted to get rid of the cabinet and the king and re-establish Catholicism. And the idea was to put 36 barrels of gunpowder under the House of Lords and blow the whole rotten lot to kingdom come and re-establish England as a Catholic country.
The gunpowder plot is an extreme reaction by a small bunch of utterly unusual young Catholic men. They're violent by nature. They're absolutely crammed full of martial arts. They have a very high proportion of recent converts or recent converts to zealous Catholicism. And they are basically people at odds with the world and looking for glory. They're exactly the kind of profile from which a jihadi is constructed.
They represented a rebirth of passion against suppression, against all the anti-Catholic measures that had been introduced. They were not going to take it from James. So just 2 years into his reign, they plotted something so devastating, so audacious, that it really does draw parallels with the major terrorist threats of today. They wanted nothing less than the destruction of the entire regime. They were going to achieve it by blowing up the king and Parliament.
The main conspirators were all Catholic extremists. Thomas Wintour, John Wright, Thomas Percy, Guy Fawkes, and the ringleader, Robert Catesby. Their first meeting took place on the 20th of May, 1604, at the Duck and Drake Inn just off the Strand in London. They had just over a year to plan one of the most audacious terror plots ever devised.
Gentlemen, what we are planning is the most ambitious assassination plot in this nation's history. When King James opens Parliament, we will blow him, his bastard ministers, and the rest of the stinking edifice that is Parliament off the face of this earth.
Aye.
Now, it's not going to be easy by any chalk, but I have a plan that I am confident will work.
We have secured lodgings.
The gunpowder plot is the brainchild, if one can use the expression for somebody of such addled wits, of a particularly wild and charismatic man called Robert Catesby, who is clearly a charmer because he has a knack of persuading people who should know better into falling in with his idea. And it simply is to put an immense amount of high explosive underneath where the king and the royal family are going to meet the two houses of Parliament to open Parliament itself, and send the lot sky high along with the Palace of Westminster, about half of Westminster Abbey, and all the surrounding houses. This is the detonative power of a low-level atomic weapon.
We have secured lodgings opposite Westminster. And now, thanks to Percy, we have obtained the undercroft beneath Parliament itself. The powder is stored in the palace on the other side of the river. And so we will need to move it across first to the lodgings and then to the undercroft bit by bit.
Yes, the barrels will be moved across the Thames at night and land on the steps here, and then moved to the chambers underneath Parliament itself. And then we wait. We wait till the state opening, and boom. Gentlemen, it is set.
With their plan set, the group moved fast. One of the plotters, Thomas Percy, rented a small property and a cellar right under the Palace of Westminster. And Guy Fawkes, using the pseudonym John Johnson, moved in, posing as Percy's servant. Then the plotters used Robert Catesby's lodgings in Lambeth on the opposite bank of the Thames, where they stored the barrels of gunpowder.
There is immense difficulty for a modern mind in trying to understand how the gunpowder plot could get that far, because mentalities are so different then. There really is no security about the Palace of Westminster. It's a whole bunch of private tenements and sublets on which nobody checks up. And nobody has ever tried to use high explosive in a conspiracy in this manner before in history. So it really is something unthinkable. And finally, the gunpowder itself is an unknown quantity. Nobody knows what gunpowder is going to do in such a situation, including the plotters themselves. So that's the reason, in my opinion, why such a thoroughly unlikely conspiracy gets as far as it does.
I think had the gunpowder plot been successful, it would have been a cataclysmic event which we perhaps don't have any modern equivalent. The way that it would have changed the future of England, the future of what would become the United Kingdom, the political dimensions, religious dimensions, moral dimensions, would have been absolutely enormous.
The emotional impact of the gunpowder plot, especially if it had worked, would have been the equivalent of 9/11 in those days, because, you know, it was shocking, and killing the monarch was something you just didn't do. And it's impossible to be accurate about the consequences, but they would have been very widespread and very long-lasting.
Simon Carter is a former curator of the Houses of Parliament who studied the plotters' plans in detail. Nothing remains of the 17th century buildings that they planned to blow up. But even today, it's easy to get a sense of the scale of the terrorist attack they were planning.
It's hard to imagine as we look at it today that in the early 17th century, when Guy Fawkes would have planned to row across the river and deposit his gunpowder barrels, that we'd have been looking at a building a series of buildings with inns, houses, private gardens, and a small-scale building over there, really. And the idea of somebody just walking in there and kind of being able to rent a space, not that inconceivable. Now we kind of find that the Palace of Westminster is surrounded by security. It needs to be. But in those days, there wasn't any security at the Palace of Westminster. It was a place where people lived. It was a place where people went and had a drink. There was people going around. And there was even private houses, all facing onto the river with their own gardens. So it's thought that the plotters had rented accommodation on the south of the river over at Lambeth. Well, in fact, it would have been fairly easy to get the barrels of gunpowder over the river, and there was landing stages across this view here. So the Parliament stairs where Guy Fawkes transported the gunpowder barrels to was probably halfway along, in line with the Victoria Tower across there. And he'd have been able to hire a boat. There'd have been lots of ferry boats and other traffic on the river, so one more boat carrying some barrels wouldn't have been an extraordinary thing.
The only remaining feature from the time of the gunpowder plot is the entrance to the House of Lords, which today is in the same location as the doorway that James I would have used.
There's absolutely nothing left of the medieval buildings and the 17th century chamber of the House of Lords, which Guy Fawkes planned to blow up. It all got swept away, partly in the early 19th century, in order to redevelop the House of Lords for new buildings, and then later on, the rest of the buildings that had survived were burnt in a fire and demolished in order to build this building here. So none of the cellars, none of the chamber itself, and none of the accommodation that Guy Fawkes would have known in his time is here anymore. The gunpowder plot would probably have succeeded. He confined a large amount of gunpowder inside the basement of a building which was stone built and which had got solid rubble walls that were about 2 or 3 feet thick and without many exits. So all of that explosion, had he succeeded, would have gone very much upwards, and there was only a relatively simple wooden floor between the King's throne at the far end of the House of Lords and the gunpowder barrels which were stored just below it in the cellar. If the gunpowder plot had succeeded, the chamber and the House of Lords, with all its assembled king, royal family and dignitary, would have been blown to smithereens. It would have been one of the most major explosions that London had ever seen.
Their plan in place and the location secured, it was now time to deal with the explosives. According to Fawkes's written confession, 20 barrels of gunpowder were brought across the River Thames at night, followed by a second load of 16 more. Each one having to be carefully rolled up the steps from the river and down a narrow street into the cellar entrance. If they were caught, the plot was over.
If it had succeeded, the gunpowder plot would have been one of the great atrocities of world history, the English equivalent to one of the great massacres that occurred in other countries. It could have happened had the plotters managed to keep the plot within their own ranks. The only problem with the plot is that in order to get it to succeed once it's gone off, you need to have quite a few people knowing about it so they know what the plan B is. And the problem with having quite a few people knowing is it's going to leak.
Had the gunpowder plot have succeeded, it would have not only changed the course of British history, but world history. And to be quite honest, it would have been the most audacious terror attack in the history of the world.
Make haste, men. Make haste.
It was reported that the 36 barrels contained some 5,000 pounds of gunpowder, a staggering amount at the time, and more than enough to destroy the brick and timber building above. To show just how destructive gunpowder can be, explosives expert Ian Henn has agreed to detonate a much smaller amount, but use the same black powder and fuse that Guy Fawkes would have had.
The plan is we're going to have a test of a small explosion first, with it being unconfined and in all directions. We'll have to start with a small explosion of about 1 pound, and we'll see how we go with that.
Back in his workshop, Ian had created the gunpowder for the demonstration. He mixed up a small quantity of charcoal, potassium nitrate, and sulfur, and ground them into a fine powder to create the final material that would be loaded into the barrel. But before taking it up to the site, he tested it to make sure it fired up successfully.
Okay, firing the powder.
Gunpowder has a very slow burn rate, and in the open produces a lot of flame and smoke. But when it's packed tightly into barrels, it's highly explosive.
This is a cable for the detonator, or technically igniter, to set the powder off. Because we don't exactly know what's going to happen, we need to make sure we're at a safe distance to set this off. So we'll lay a wire out and we can power the detonator from that. With gunpowder, it's a low-order explosive, so you only get a big explosion if it's very well confined. With this sort of situation, we're not going to get a massive blast because it's not confined in a gun barrel or in a building. With the Houses of Parliament, there were so many barrels that the gunpowder tends to become its own confinement. So that the blast, when it goes off, will confine itself and help to give you a bigger explosion. And that's why it would have worked if it had gone off in that sort of quantity. This is 1 pound of gunpowder, and we'll see the sort of explosion this makes very shortly. But to give you some sort of idea, in the House of Parliament, they were supposedly caught with 5,500 pounds of powder, or somewhere in that region. So they're really talking about quite a large amount of gunpowder. So we've got a box ready. We'll just top it up, and then we'll get on and get it set up.
Ian has filled a wooden box with about 10 pounds of gunpowder, only a fraction of what would have been in each of Guy Fawkes' barrels. But it would give a good indication of the scale of the blast that was being planned.
This is coarse, modern coarse blasting powder. It's very similar grain size, perhaps a little smaller than they would have used, but it's a lot bigger than you'd use in a musket or a small firearm.
The next step was to rig the box of gunpowder in the field and lay a small fuse leading up to it, just as Guy Fawkes would have done. The difference today is that Ian will be detonating the blast from a safe distance using an electrical charge, whereas Guy Fawkes would have had to have been next to the barrels and lit it by hand.
I think it's very likely that Guy Fawkes would have died in the blast. He couldn't have been very far away from the explosion to actually be able to light the fuse or light the powder trail. The blast radius could have been hundreds of yards from the initial explosion. Would have been stone, timber, all sorts of debris flying, and it's likely that he would have been killed in the explosion. Right, okay, you ready, Roo? And Chris is clear. Chris is clear. Put the wires across the battery, and we'll fire it. You ready? Okay, everybody ready? Firing the charge!
The modern equivalent to the gunpowder plot was 9/11. It was something that was so simple and so effective and in many ways so easy to do that nobody saw it coming. And it really did aim to destroy thousands and thousands of people with major landmarks. And had the whole of it succeeded, that is the Pentagon gone as well, that's what it would have been.
By the late autumn of 1605, everything was ready. All Guy Fawkes had to do was light the fuse and then escape quickly to France. The barrels were in place, and the date of destiny was fast approaching, the 5th of November.
Remember, the 5th of November. Gunpowder, treason, and plot.
What happens next is truly astonishing. Lord Monteagle, a Catholic peer who was also married to the sister of one of the plotters, received a letter on October 26th, warning him not to attend the state opening of Parliament on November the 5th.
Just days before the opening of Parliament, Lord Monteagle, a prominent member of the cabinet, receives a letter, an anonymous letter, warning him not to attend the opening of Parliament because his life will be in danger. He rushes off to Cecil, gives him the letter, tells him what's happening. And Cecil does absolutely nothing.
I don't think that the Monteagle letter, which gave the gunpowder plot away, is what it seems to be. I think that somebody, probably Monteagle, possibly Cecil, went and wrote it as a cover for the discovery of the plot. I think the plot leaked verbally a few days before that. The letter was the most dramatic way of covering this up.
It was all a bit too scripted, I think. I think it's perfectly possible that Cecil had that letter written if he didn't actually write it in his own hand.
My lords, this letter was passed to me by Sir Robert Monteagle. It is a warning to him not to attend the state opening of Parliament tomorrow for fear of death. I believe that there is a plot to attack His Majesty the King and all his ministers when they sit in Parliament. God save the King.
God save the King.
I pray that we are not too late.
Surprisingly, Cecil sits on the letter for about a week before informing the king, who immediately orders a sweep of Parliament, including the cellars. In a bizarre twist of fate, Guy Fawkes is discovered, but not the barrels of gunpowder, and he isn't arrested. It was only when a second search was ordered by Cecil that he's captured and the barrels are found, hidden under piles of wood and tree branches.
Legend has it that Robert Cecil could well have been behind the gunpowder plot and was using it to discredit the Catholics. I think it's more likely that through his spy network that he knew that this was going to happen, but rather than cutting it off straight away, he let it run. So that literally just before the fuses were lit, he then stopped it, which of course then had a much greater impact because the country realised that they were going to lose the king and the whole of Parliament. And this meant that he could bury these Catholic plotters forever.
Open up in the name of the king!
I don't think that any sane historian at the present day, or even any mad historian of whom I've heard, seriously thinks that Cecil made up the gunpowder plot himself. There was a real plot. And we can tell this because we can see the government finding out more and more about it. But it is practically certain that Cecil knew about the plot a week before it was supposed to go off, and let it ripen deliberately to find out as much as possible about it, and also milk the dramatic effect of a last-minute discovery for all it was worth.
But to be honest, on reflection, there are certain anomalies that make me wonder whether Robert Cecil was behind the gunpowder plot. And when you actually think that they somehow managed to get 36 barrels of gunpowder. From where? And hire a cellar under the House of Lords and fill it with these barrels of gunpowder without anybody noticing. I sometimes wonder, there could be more in this than anybody realises.
It's extraordinary to think that this group of Catholic conspirators could have gone about London amassing an extraordinary quantity of gunpowder, have started to stay in houses close to Parliament, build up this little terror network without his knowledge. It defies belief. I think Cecil let it play out until the crucial moment, and then, of course, got there in time to stop it.
If indeed he was playing that game, it was a very dangerous game because, I mean, yes, the gunpowder plotters weren't that bright. They didn't really cover their tracks. There is some suggestion that they were really quite drunk most of the time. I suppose you'd have to be to do something like that. But nevertheless, he did leave it till the very last minute to basically rummage around in the crypt of the Houses of Parliament and find Fawkes and the gunpowder. I mean, it was more luck than good management, perhaps, towards the end of that.
The great problem that Cecil faced with the gunpowder plot was how fast let it go on. And of course, if he let it go on too long, if he didn't press the button that would have gone and stopped the plot and round up all the plotters, then there was a real chance that Parliament would have gone bang, and we know what would have happened since. The country would have become a Catholic state, and history would have been rewritten. So knowing precisely when to press that button to stop a plot is crucial, and Cecil did press it at the right time. But the risks of pressing it too late or not pressing it at all are absolutely catastrophic.
The plot now in tatters, Guy Fawkes, still using the name John Johnson, was hauled off to the Tower of London for interrogation and torture.
Come on, just one name. No! Right, rack him again.
The king demanded to know who was behind this plot. And after a week or more of brutal punishment, Fawkes eventually gave up his fellow plotters, and they were all executed. What could have been the most atrocious terrorist attack on British soil had been averted.
If the gunpowder plot had succeeded, it would have been the single greatest act of terror ever, perhaps even from today. You know, there is no comparator to that seismic event that it would have been. It would have swept away an entire regime. It would have been pretty much the end of the Stuarts, just 2 years into their rule in England. Who would have been the new king? Who would have been the new parliament? They would have had to have pretty much started from scratch. We would have had a completely different royal family.
Very little material from the plot has survived down through the years. But the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford has Fawkes's lantern, and the National Archives in Kew has his original signed confession. One of the curators at the archives, Nick Barrett, agreed to take it out of the vaults and reveal its content.
This is the signed confession of Guy Fawkes, just a few days after he'd been captured in the cellars of Westminster Palace, surrounded by barrels of gunpowder. He's taken to the Tower, and on the personal instructions of the king himself, he is tortured. Gentle at first, but increasing pressure to extract this confession. By the 9th of November, when this is signed, he's given it all up. There are a series of questions asked of him, again, coming directly from the king. Who are you? How are you operating? Who are you operating with? And Guy Fawkes gives this information. He names the other co-conspirators. He explains what his mission is, to kill the king. and he links himself to the Catholic sympathisers. So again, this goes to the heart of Tudor paranoia about the enemy within Britain. And in many ways, this must have sent a shiver down the spine of those officials who were listening to him recount this tale of conspiracy and treachery. This is the threat of a Catholic uprising. Many of these people have been turned, corrupted almost, by Jesuits sent from the continent to come and assassinate the government. And here it is laid bare in all its grim detail. The really amazing thing about this document is that you can physically see the impact of torture. Many documents tell a story through the words, but this tells you something because Guy Fawkes' signature is so faint, virtually illegible. He would have been tortured on the rack, a horrible stretching device, but also probably had his hands crushed as well. And we see this because it's very hard to make out his own signature here. So it's a very poignant physical demonstration of what torture does. But equally, you've also got his inquisitors signing the document, saying that they were present when he finally put his hand here, maybe even guiding the pen themselves.
In the end, Robert Cecil had a spectacular career by any political yardstick, rising to hold jointly the two highest civil offices of the land during the reigns of both Elizabeth I and James I. He'd grown the spy and intelligence network inherited from his father into a huge web of power and influence. And this physically handicapped man became feared and respected in equal measure. But in the end, Robert Cecil will always be best known for foiling the most ambitious terror plot in British history and maintaining Protestant rule in England.
Robert Cecil will always be remembered for two of the most crucial moments in British history: the succession after the death of Queen Elizabeth and the gunpowder plot.
Robert Cecil should be remembered as one of the greatest royal ministers ever to serve the English state. It's ironic that about the only thing for which he is remembered, if he's even remembered for that, is he's the guy who stopped the gunpowder plot.
Robert Cecil did benefit more than anyone from the foiling of the gunpowder plot. It does, therefore, at least raise the question as to just how involved he was in the creation of that plot. It certainly worked out brilliantly. He could not have scripted it better. Was he behind it? I think there is quite compelling evidence.